Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the frosty flannel-wrapped fog of American folklore. The wind howls like a freight train. The snow falls sideways and you're trudging through a snowstorm that feels like it hasn't let up since last Thursday. And there, ahead of you, something impossibly big is happening. A house-sized cradle rocks violently in the gale. The sky cracks open with northern lights, and a baby lets out a yawn that causes a small avalanche up north. You're here for the birth of Paul Bunyan, the most comically oversized American myth this side of Bigfoot. And yes, he's enormous. So enormous legend says 5 giant storks had to carry him across state lines. His first crib A converted ox cart. And when he cried, it flattened 100 acres of pine forest. That's just how it starts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you listening from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little river of nonsense flows. Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a little logging town that doesn't have a name yet. It's just snowmen with frozen beards and trees taller than any building you've seen. Some say it's northern Maine. Others insist it was Minnesota. Historians still argue whether Paul Bunyan was born in Bangor or Bemidji, or if he was born at all. And that's the thing about tall tales. The taller they are, the harder they are to verify. But here's what they agree on the myth of Paul Bunyan, probably started in lumberjack camps in the late 1800s, when brutal winters and 18-hour workdays needed a little exaggeration to stay interesting. Workers swapped stories by the fireside of giant blue oxen, flapjacks bigger than your bed, and a man so strong he could sneeze down a redwood. Back to Paul. His first word might have been timber, or pancake, or if you believe some French-Canadian accounts, something completely incomprehensible because Paul was already speaking fluent moose. There's a fringe theory floating around that Bunyan is an adaptation of old French lumber camp characters like Bunyan, who was less a giant and more a rowdy, oversized personality with a thing for wrestling bears. You know, totally normal pioneer behavior as he grew. Because of course he did, Paul supposedly outgrew 9 cribs, 4 barns, and 1 steamboat hull before his 2nd birthday. His diapers were made from the sails of a schooner. His baby food was porridge stirred in a cauldron big enough to bathe a horse. One day, while learning to crawl, he rolled downhill and cleared 30 acres of forest. No one was even mad. Timber prices went up that month. You hear about Paul's family, too. His father, allegedly a stoic man with arms like tree trunks, tried to raise him right. But what do you do when your toddler accidentally sneezes a cabin into splinters? When he chews on axes like teething rings? When he claps in excitement and causes small tremors in Vermont? Some locals say Paul had a younger brother. Others say he had 7. One recurring tale features a sister named Pauline who could outswim salmon and braid pine trees like hair. But most stories conveniently leave family out of the picture altogether, probably because trying to make sense of Paul's DNA raises more questions than answers. Oh, and don't forget the strange weather that followed Paul around. It's whispered that the blizzard that marked his birth lasted 3 months and froze birds mid-flight. That's somewhere deep in the archives of meteorology. There's a note about an unexplainable snow baby phenomenon in the winter of 1872. Completely made up, of course, but still oddly specific. You start noticing how even the town seems to lean toward exaggeration. Streets are extra wide. Every doorframe's too tall. The general store sells flannel in only one size enormous. And when you ask the locals about Paul, they just smile, shake their heads and say, "You had to be there," which lucky for you are. But beneath the layers of snow flannel and food that would make a state fair blush, there's something warm and oddly comforting about this myth. It's American absurdity at its finest, bold, brash, and completely unapologetic. Paul Bunyan didn't just cut down trees. He reshaped the land. He made mountains by piling up rocks. He made rivers by dragging his heels. And whether you believe a word of it or not, it's kind of nice to pretend. And so as you walk back toward that ridiculous cradle under the northern lights, you start to understand. Paul isn't just a big guy in a tall tale. He's a metaphor for endurance, for invention, for eating your feelings via griddle cakes the size of swimming pools. You pause. The snow falls softly now. Somewhere in the woods, a tree creaks, maybe from age, maybe from being gently pushed by a giant baby looking for breakfast. And just like that, you're hooked. You're standing outside a barn. Or wait, is it a barn? Or just Paul Bunyan's old baby cradle? It's hard to tell. The thing towers over you. There's a tree growing through one corner of it, and some enterprising squirrels have made it their 5-level condominium. Wind whistles through its wooden slats, like a harmonica played by a ghost. This is where Paul spent his toddler years. Or at least that's what the old men at the cafe will tell you after 2 mugs of strong coffee and a plate of ham thick enough to stop a bullet. Inside, young Paul was energetic. You know, in the way that hurricanes are energetic. The moment he started crawling, entire herds of cows relocated out of fear. His first toy, a rolling pin the size of a canoe. He was so large that when he sneezed, it derailed a train in the next county, not maliciously, just accidentally. He once mistook a grain silo for a salt shaker. You get the idea. At mealtimes, things got complicated. You tiptoe into the old mess hall, though calling it that is generous. It's more like a cathedral for carbohydrates. The ceiling is scorched from years of pancake flipping gone wrong. The walls are sticky from maple syrup incidents that were apparently declared natural disasters. And in the center sits Paul's chair. A normal bench wouldn't do, obviously, so they built him a throne out of railroad ties and buffalo hides. Now, if you ask the kitchen staff, usually a rotating cast of wide-eyed cooks and volunteers from neighboring towns, they'll tell you Paul could eat 40 pancakes in 1 minute. But more fringe retellings claim he once devoured 100 in a single breath. His syrup intake required an entire maple forest to be tapped before dawn. Rumors even swirl that he used whole fir trees as toothpicks. This isn't just gluttony, though. No. This was fuel. Fuel for what was to come. Because toddler Paul wasn't just strong, he was surprisingly coordinated. He could stack logs faster than most adults, often by accident. You'd blink, and he'd have turned a lumber pile into a log cabin. Not always livable, sure, but definitely impressive for someone who still thought pine cones were snacks. One time, Paul got hold of a wagon full of iron nails. He thought they were candy. He swallowed half the load before anyone could stop him. For 3 days he didn't sleep, just paced in circles, and apparently attracted lightning. Magnetic personality, someone said. The locals still blame him for the town's old clock tower, leaning at a weird angle, but the wildest tale from these years, it might be the one with the bears. Because apparently, Paul could talk to them, not roar or growl actual conversations. Local legend says he once brokered a peace treaty between 2 rival bear clans over a huckleberry grove. You imagine him seated cross-legged in the forest, surrounded by grumpy brown bears arguing about fruit. His solution: just plant more bushes. Some historians suggest this part of the myth originated from Native American stories about humans communicating with forest animals. Others think it's just a result of too many cold nights and too much moonshine. But either way, it's stuck. The image of little Paul sipping tea with 2 grizzlies and a raccoon still appears in children's books across the Midwest. Of course, with great size comes great inconvenience. There were logistical issues, like housing. His family had to move 5 times before he was 10, not because they couldn't afford the land, but because Paul kept growing through the roof. Literally. His head popped through ceilings like daisies in spring. Once, he outgrew an entire 2-story home during a particularly rainy May. The town's solution: just remove the roof and let him sleep under the stars. Which worked, until it snowed. Then there were the wardrobe challenges. A typical tailor couldn't cut it, pun fully intended. His clothes were stitched by a blacksmith and a sailmaker working overtime. His shoes were made from hollowed-out canoes. His mittens sewn from full-grown bison hides. And still, they only lasted a season. You hear about Paul's best friend during these years too. Not Babe, he hasn't shown up yet. No, this friend was a raccoon named Tiny. Ironic name, obviously. Tiny was the size of a standard mule and followed Paul everywhere. Some claim Tiny once scared off a pack of wolves by simply yawning too loudly. Others say he played fetch with entire trees. But most stories agree Paul and Tiny parted ways after Tiny tried to hibernate in someone's barn and caused a local cheese famine. The details are hazy, and this, you realize, is the beauty of the Paul Bunyan myth. It's elastic. It stretches to fit whatever moral joke or weather report you need. He grows larger with every retelling. The snowstorm gets colder, the pancake taller, the raccoon bolder. Still, historians keep digging through folklore, through archived newspapers, through yellowed lumberjack diaries. Some believe the Bunyan stories started as exaggerated retellings of actual lumberjack feats, like the men who could chop through a tree in 10 strokes, or carry 2 logs across frozen rivers without breaking stride. Others say Paul was born in ad copy invented by timber companies to add flair to logging ads. The Red River Lumber Company, for instance, printed Paul stories in the early 1900s to promote its products. So really, Paul might have been one of the first great marketing mascots, right up there with Mr. Peanut and the Michelin Man. But let's not get too academic. You're here for a sleepy story. And sleepy stories work best when you don't question them too much. So you lean back, listen to the snow gently tapping on the windows of this oversized cradle, and picture toddler Paul chewing on a wagon wheel while discussing tree bark flavor profiles with a bear named Maurice in this strange cold world that feels just about right. You're standing at the edge of a snowbank so deep it swallowed fences, farmhouses, and your sense of direction. The air is still eerily still, and the cold has that sharp metallic bite that numbs your teeth just by breathing. You hear a sound like muffled grumbling under the snow, a sort of deep, icy moan. And then it moves. A shape stirs in the frost. Massive. Blue. Hooved. And that's how you meet Babe. No, not the pig. This is Babe the blue ox, Paul Bunyan's legendary companion best friend and alleged snowmaking machine. You know you found the right ox because the snow on your jacket starts to freeze into delicate lace. The temperature drops another 10 degrees just standing near him. The cold breath of Babe is said to have turned summer fields into winter wonderlands. Or at least that's what folks at the diner say when it's too hot for August. Babe wasn't always frozen blue. Some say he started out as a regular calf. Well, regular, in the Bunyan universe, meaning the size of a delivery truck. But then came the winter. You know the one. The winter so long, the sun gave up and filed a resignation letter. The snow didn't fall. It arrived and never left. Rivers froze mid-current. Birds forgot how to fly. And somewhere in the middle of that impossible season, Paul found Babe stuck in a snowdrift. He dug him out with a coal shovel, the size of a canoe, fed him flapjacks by the dozen, and wrapped him in a quilt woven from woolly mammoths. When Babe finally opened his eyes, they glowed like twin northern stars. His first breath froze 3 trees solid. Paul laughed so hard he cracked a frozen pond in half. Historians still argue whether Babe was inspired by the hardy oxen used in early American logging, or if he's just another layer of exaggeration wrapped in blue mythology. Some even think Babe symbolizes the brutal winters faced by frontier loggers, a living embodiment of nature's raw, uncaring chill. Or, maybe people were just bored. Because honestly, how else do you explain a blue ox that snows when he sneezes? From that day forward, Paul and Babe were inseparable. Wherever Paul went, Babe followed, usually knocking over barns, snapping bridges in half, or freezing lakes by just standing too long. They were opposites in mood, though. Paul was loud and boisterous. Babe was quiet, contemplative, possibly due to mild hypothermia. They communicated in a mix of whistles, tree knocks, and once interpretive dance. The townsfolk naturally were divided. Some were terrified of Babe. Others claimed their crops grew better after Babe walked through their fields, snow-tilled soil they called it. A few enterprising kids tried to ride him like a horse. One ended up in Canada. It took a week and 2 sled dogs to retrieve him. You hear about the time Paul tried to build a proper stable for Babe. A barn reinforced with granite beams and iron doors. It lasted until Babe rolled over in his sleep and flattened the east wall. After that, they just let him sleep outside, usually on top of frozen lakes. The fish beneath didn't mind. It was warmer down there. Babe had quirks, of course. He didn't moo like normal oxen. His sounds were more like distant thunder. He liked chewing on glacier ice and occasionally swallowed entire pine trees. There's a tale about him mistaking a lighthouse for a salt lick. The keeper still tells it with a twitch, but perhaps the oddest story, the snow trails. Because every winter, long after Paul and Babe left a place, you could follow a strange phenomenon. Little flurries swirling along paths where hooves once fell, ice forming in delicate spirals on fence posts, and barn cats curled up in odd warmth under frost-covered footprints. Scientists completely baffled, but the locals just shrugged and said, Babe must have passed through. Of course, there's a fringe theory that Babe wasn't an ox at all, but some leftover creature from Norse mythology, part frost, giant, part elemental spirit, wrapped in ox disguise for American storytelling comfort. The horns, the breath, the supernatural control of snow. It fits, they argue. But so does the idea that he was just the product of one particularly long Minnesota winter and too much coffee. You're not sure what to believe. All you know is that you're watching the great blue beast now as he snorts gently into the snow. Frost curls up from his nostrils in delicate spirals. Paul stands nearby, wearing a scarf made from something that used to roar, patting Babe's side, and whispering something that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby. Then Babe moves slowly and with great dignity. Each step presses 6 feet into the frozen ground, and behind him, a trail of snow so perfect it could be mistaken for the work of a snow plow with a poetic streak. He shakes his head, once icicles tinkling like wind chimes, and the whole valley hushes. You feel the calm settle in your bones, and it hits you. This isn't just a giant pet story. Babe is part of the landscape now, as much a force of nature as he is a character. A living snowstorm bound by friendship to a man big enough to need him. You pull your coat tighter, even though you're not cold anymore. Babe walks on, leaving a story behind with each hoofprint. You're watching the morning mist rise off a ridge of freshly cut pine when Paul Bunyan decides he's bored. You know what comes next. Boredom and Paul never end well for the landscape, at least. Today, his idea is simple: cut down more trees, but faster. Because apparently, leveling entire forests with one swing of an axe isn't efficient enough. So he walks over to Babe, slaps the blue ox affectionately on the shoulder, which causes a minor avalanche somewhere in the Rockies, and says, "We need a new tool." And that's how the 2-person crosscut saw was born. Now sure, historians point out that double-handled saws existed before Paul was even a spark in a logger's eye. They say it was likely invented by actual loggers who didn't have flannel capes or ox companions with snow breath. But in the world of Bunyan, those are just footnotes. Here, it was invented in a single afternoon, using nothing but rail steel. Babe's whisker hairs for tensioning, and a bolt of lightning for the final tempering. You trail behind as Paul sets up the first test. He hands one end of the saw to a brave lumberjack named Bill, who is already regretting every decision in his life. Paul takes the other end. On 3, they pull. The sound is apocalyptic. The saw bites through the tree like it owes Paul money. In 5 seconds, flat, the tallest pine in the region becomes a pile of polite logs neatly stacked. A squirrel sitting in its branches doesn't even have time to process its emotional arc before it's relocated to a nearby stump. From that day on, the saw becomes the standard, at least in stories. Some claim Paul made hundreds of them, handing them out like candy to aspiring lumberjacks. Others say he made only one and used it to carve a spiral staircase into a mountain because he was feeling fancy. Scholars, of course, still debate the origins. Was the saw a real innovation inspired by real needs later swept into myth? Or did the myth come first, helping to romanticize hard labor and market timber towns to city dwellers desperate for adventure? The line, much like the trees Paul felled, is blurred. Back at the camp, you see the other lumberjacks cautiously trying out the new saws. They pair up sometimes with reluctant bears or confused horses and begin cutting. At first, it's chaos. Saws fly. Trees fall in the wrong direction. One guy ends up stuck in a log, like a cartoon coin in a vending machine. But eventually, rhythm sets in. The forest hums with the sound of cooperation. Paul and Babe look on proudly. Well, Babe mostly chews on a frozen turnip, but you can tell he's proud by the way he doesn't freeze anyone on accident today. You wander over to the tool shed, or what would be a shed if it weren't the size of a small airport hangar. Inside are gadgets. Paul's tried before an axe with a built-in compass, a log-splitting hammer that doubles as a harmonica, and a pulley system so large it once accidentally moved an entire hill. Some worked, most didn't. But the saw, that one stuck. There's even a tale probably told after one too many flannel-themed festivals about Paul and Babe entering a lumberjack contest just to be polite. The rules were simple: cut 10 trees, stack the logs, cook a pancake on a campfire, and sit down for supper. Paul blinked, and the trees were down. Babe blinked, and the fire was lit. The pancake was the size of a trampoline and flipped using a steam shovel. The judges didn't even bother awarding a trophy. They just handed Paul a golden fork and renamed the town. You begin to notice something as you stroll through the camp. Every invention, every story, every exaggeration has a root in real hardship. Logging was grueling, dangerous, bone-chilling work. And stories like Paul's, they gave it color-shaped laughter. When you're cold, hungry, and surrounded by trees taller than hope, a tale of a man who could slice through them with ease is more than entertainment, it's survival. You sit down by the fire, which is burning on a log the size of a canoe. One of the older loggers nudges you and says, "Did we ever tell you about the time Paul cut down an entire forest in one sneeze?" You nod. "I heard about the saw." He smiles. Same story, just different day. And that's the thing Paul's stories are like that saw. Meant to be shared. Meant to be pulled back and forth between friends, each adding a little more bite to the tale. Until the line between real and ridiculous is so thin, no one cares anymore. You look over, and there he is, Paul humming to himself while carving initials into a redwood with a pocket knife the size of a rowboat. Babe sleeps nearby, exhaling a fog that gently covers the camp in frost. And somewhere deep in the woods, another tree falls. Not from age, not from wind, just because Paul Bunyan got bored again. You blink and the landscape has changed again. That's how it always is with Paul. What was once a forest is now a canyon, a vast gaping wound in the earth that stretches to the horizon. You step to the edge, pebbles crunching under your boots, and peer down into the carved-out mystery below. Grand Canyon, Paul mutters casually behind you, as if he just misplaced a pair of socks. Yes, that Grand Canyon. The story goes like this one morning. Paul woke up, yawned, stretched, and couldn't find his axe. It had gone missing again, which tends to happen when your tools are large enough to be mistaken for bridges. So naturally, he wandered the countryside dragging a backup axe behind him. A dull one. One he didn't particularly like. The kind you only use when your favorite is lost in a glacier or embedded in a steam locomotive. He dragged it absent-mindedly behind him for miles, hundreds of miles, leaving a trench in his wake. And apparently, that trench became one of the most iconic natural formations on the planet. Geologists are understandably not thrilled about this version. They've written books, given lectures, and shouted from cliffsides about tectonic uplift erosion and sediment layers older than human history. But none of them can explain the oddly axe-shaped boulder at the canyon's edge, or the pine trees at the bottom that spell out oops. Some folks say the Grand Canyon theory started as a joke, a throwaway line from a campfire tale that got repeated so often it became canon. Others argue it was a metaphor. Paul's restlessness, his urge to roam, leaving marks not just on forests, but on the bones of the earth itself. Historians still argue whether this myth reflects frontier ambition or just a very aggressive landscaping accident. You walk with him now along the canyon rim. He's humming again, a low tune that rumbles the rocks. Babe lumbers beside him, huffing little clouds of snow that evaporate before hitting the sun-baked ground. It's an odd pairing, giant man, frost-breathing ox, and the Arizona sun. But somehow, it works. You come across a tree stump right on the canyon edge. It's old, cracked by time and lightning. Paul plops down on it like a stool, the poor thing creaking in protest. He takes off his boots, shakes out a squirrel or two, and sighs. I didn't mean to make it that deep. He says, eyes on the horizon, just lost in thought. There's a calmness here that's different from the lumber camps. No clanging saws, no crashing trees. Just wind space and the distant cry of a hawk that may or may not be carrying a full-grown elk. You let it all wash over you. Paul tells you another version of the tale. In this one, the canyon wasn't a mistake at all. It was a plan. He wanted to redirect a river to help irrigate the west, make farming easier, grow more flapjack ingredients. But he misjudged the turn, and well, here we are. A little too ambitious with the topography. You picture him standing knee-deep in red rock, trying to shape the land like wet clay. It's not a stretch. After all, this is a man who once turned a mountain into a spoon because he forgot to pack one for breakfast. There's a fringe theory that the canyon isn't even the biggest thing Paul carved. That somewhere in Alaska or Wyoming, or that part of Oregon nobody talks about, there's a bigger, deeper trench, covered by trees and time. But no one's found it. Yet. As you sit beside him, the sun begins to dip. The canyon shifts colors, ochre, gold, deep wine. Shadows stretch across its ridges like lazy cats. Paul doesn't speak. Neither do you. Even Babe seems hushed, his breaths forming small, respectful clouds. It's in this quiet that the myth feels most real. Not in the exaggerations or punchlines, but in the stillness that follows. The moment where a story becomes landscape, where fantasy settles into fact, not because it's true, but because it's believed. Eventually, Paul stands. The stump sighs in relief. He brushes the dust from his coat, whistles to Babe, and starts walking again. Away from the canyon, toward the next stretch of unknown forest, unknown land. You hesitate, glancing back once more at the impossible scale of it all, and then you follow. Because when Paul Bunyan drags an axe behind him, you never know what new place the world will become next. You find yourself in the back of a sleigh. Not a cozy jingle bell kind of sleigh, but a monstrous contraption pulled by Babe through snow so deep the tops of pine trees peek out like fence posts. Paul is driving, or rather standing on the runners, guiding the reins with one hand while sipping hot coffee from a mug carved out of a pumpkin. You're heading west, or maybe east. Directions feel optional at this point. All you know is you're moving through blizzard country on what Paul cheerfully refers to as his winter road trip to Dakota. Because when the snow piles up and temperatures plummet, what else is a man to do but relocate an entire lumber operation 300 miles overnight? The legend goes that Paul didn't just travel in winter, he conquered it. The cold never seemed to bother him. Some say his body heat alone melted trails through the forest. Others whisper that he wore the same red flannel year-round, and it simply adapted to the seasons out of fear. You huddle under a thick quilt as the sleigh hurtles forward. Snowflakes the size of silver dollars pepper the air. Trees blur past in blue and white streaks. Every few minutes, Paul points to a landmark and mutters something like, "Accidentally made that mountain," or "Oops, that was Babe's nap spot." The logistics of the trip are staggering. Behind you, dozens of sleighs carry tools, cook stoves, tents, and barrels of maple syrup the size of grain silos. There's even a portable pancake griddle with its own steam engine. No one travels light in Paul's world. The destination, somewhere in the Dakotas, where timber was rumored to be thick and untapped, and the ground cold enough to keep bacon frozen between shifts. Some say Paul chose the spot by watching how the stars reflected off icicles. Others claim he flipped a coin the size of a manhole cover. Historians do agree on one thing: lumber crews did move seasonally. They followed work weather and rumor. Entire logging towns appeared and disappeared like migrating birds. The Dakota move might be a myth, but it reflects a real truth. Frontier, life was in constant motion. You arrive just before dawn. The sleigh glides into a valley where trees huddle together like nervous choir boys. Paul hops off, cracks his knuckles loud enough to startle an owl 2 counties over, and gets to work. You help unload. Kind of. Mostly, you just watch in awe as he builds a bunkhouse in 10 minutes flat. Babe digs out a cooking pit using one hoof. A group of squirrels shows up and starts organizing kitchen supplies. No one questions it. By midday, there's a dining hall, 2 sawmills, and a dance floor, because Paul believes even the coldest camps need a little joy. Someone starts a fiddle tune. A moose waltzes with a porcupine. You don't ask questions anymore. There's a rumor that Babe caused the blizzard that blanketed the region the night before. Something about a sneeze and a badly timed peppermint stick. Paul shrugs it off. Weather's just sensitive, he says. You gotta treat it gentle. You overhear one of the cooks muttering about how the last logging town Paul built turned into a national park because he forgot to take it down. Tourists still visit, buy postcards, get confused, but even in all this chaos, Paul stays focused. He's scouting timber marking trees with his pinky nail, which for the record leaves notches big enough for raccoons to nap in. He hums as he walks, and the snow seems to part for him. Babe follows tail, gently sweeping paths clear. It's efficient, poetic, and mildly terrifying. And yes, there's another story, because there always is, about the time Paul built a road through the Rockies, using nothing but his boots and a can-do attitude. Scholars roll their eyes, but those same scholars have never explained why there's a straight, inexplicable stretch of trail near Deadwood, labeled only as Paul's shortcut. Fringe theorists claim Paul was experimenting with weather control during this time, that he could command the clouds, bend the wind, even turn fog into firewood. One particularly enthusiastic pamphlet from 1912 claims Paul once stopped an avalanche with a lullaby. It sold poorly, but has a cult following. Night falls. The New Dakota camp glows warm under candle lanterns. Paul reclines against a half-built barn and sips cider so hot it hisses in the snow. Babe curls up nearby, creating a frost dome that gently refrigerates the food stores. You sit beside them, blanket pulled tight, and realize something this road trip isn't about moving wood or building camps. It's about motion itself. Paul doesn't settle. He shapes the land, then moves on. Not because he's running, but because the world's too big to stay still in. And as you drift off under the stars, stars that seem brighter somehow, out here in Paul's country, you hear him whisper something to Babe. Next, stop the Rockies. Maybe even the moon. You wouldn't bet against him. You wake to the scent of smoke sizzling fat and maple. Lots of maple. The sun hasn't even cleared the treetops, but the cookhouse in Paul Bunyan's Dakota camp is already alive, puffing steam like a riverboat in July. You follow your nose, because really, what other compass does one need when Paul Bunyan's breakfast is involved? The building itself is more of a cathedral to carbohydrates. Massive timbers form its walls. The stove spans half the length of a football field. Hanging above the cook's station, a ladle so big it's stored in a pulley system like a church bell. One of the cooks, named Tiny, despite weighing 3 axe handles across, gives you a wave while shoveling what appears to be 200 pounds of pancake batter into a cast iron skillet the size of a grain silo lid. Breakfast in a Bunyan camp isn't just a meal, it's a production. You find your seat on a log bench beside a steaming plate piled high with flapjacks, sausage links as thick as your arm, and what might be eggs or very tiny omelets. The syrup is dispensed through a hose, not because it's more efficient, though it is, but because Paul once tried pouring it from a barrel and nearly drowned a chicken. Paul himself, already halfway through his second helping. He eats casually, as if he isn't demolishing what would be considered a week's supply at a regular lumber camp. Babe sits beside the building, his breath frosting the walls, and occasionally licks up spilled batter from a nearby trough. There's a story for every food item on the plate. That sausage made from pigs. Paul bred to be extra cylindrical. The eggs collected from hens so large they had their own barn. The syrup tapped from trees. Paul convinced to flow faster by singing lullabies. It's absurd. It's also somehow completely believable in this world where myth and breakfast hold equal power. You listen to the cooks bicker over whose turn it is to stir the grits cauldron, an iron vat, requiring 2 men a paddle, and the moral support of 3 raccoons. There's talk of installing a pancake flipping crane after the last manual attempt launched a flapjack into orbit. Some say it's still up there. The idea of scale hits you. Not just Paul's size, but the scale of everything around him. Because when your boss can use a redwood as a toothpick, your approach to cooking construction and portion control tends to adjust accordingly. Historians have traced the root of these mealtime exaggerations to actual lumber camps where food was serious business. When you're burning 6,000 calories a day hauling logs through snow, you need hearty meals. And in that context, the myth of Paul eating 300 pancakes becomes less silly and more aspirational. A morale boost disguised as a bedtime belly laugh. You overhear another cook talking about Paul's picky eating phase. Yes, even giants have those. For 2 weeks, he refused anything that wasn't shaped like a log. Everything had to be cylindrical. Pancakes were rolled like yoga mats. Sausages, of course, were fine. Mashed potatoes became difficult, but nothing compares to the story of the day the syrup ran out. The entire camp went into a panic. Paul looked betrayed. Babe let out a mournful snort that froze 6 nearby chickens. The solution? Paul walked north, tapped 500 trees by hand, and returned with enough syrup to fill a pond. They renamed it Syrup Lake. Locals ice skate on it now in January. You take another bite. The food here is comforting in a way that's hard to explain. Maybe it's the warmth. Maybe it's the laughter. Maybe it's the knowledge that someone somewhere decided that making eggs with an ox-driven egg beater was the most efficient method possible. Of course, the meal ends with a story. Paul, mouth still full, begins telling the tale of the time he cooked for the entire state of North Dakota, using only an old iron mine and 3 matches. No one questions it. Someone just passes him another plate. Even Babe gets a treat, a frozen squash rolled in oats and chilled in the snow for exactly 24 hours. He crunches through it with the contented sigh of a beast who knows his breakfast is better than most 5-star hotels. There's a fringe theory floating among folklorists that Paul's cookhouse stories were early American attempts at satire mocking the over-the-top advertisements of the era. You can see their point. But you also see something else joy. These stories, ridiculous as they are full of joy. They turn labor into legend, hunger into hilarity, snowstorms into seasoning. You finish your plate utterly full and a little drowsy from the warmth. Around you, the camp begins to stir. Lumberjacks stretch tools, clatter, and somewhere a moose is trying to steal a biscuit. But for now, you linger, just a moment longer. Because here in Paul Bunyan's breakfast hall, the world makes a little more sense. The coffee is bottomless. The flapjacks are wide as wagon wheels. And the only thing colder than the Dakota wind is Babe's breath curling against the rising sun. You're swatting at the air, but it's useless. The buzz is constant, angry, and closer than it has any right to be. Paul Bunyan's Dakota camp is under siege, not by bears, not by rival loggers, not even by a frost giant with a grudge. No, it's mosquitoes, but not just any mosquitoes. These are the kind of bugs that belong in nightmares. Mosquitoes so big they have license plates. Mosquitoes that can pick up a raccoon and fly away with it. One of them just landed on Babe's back and started drawing patterns in the frost. You duck as one whizzes past, leaving a vapor trail. Someone yells, "Get the swatters," and a dozen lumberjacks charge in wielding oars, frying pans, and one guy with a badminton net the size of a wagon wheel. It's war. The legend of Paul Bunyan's battle with the giant mosquitoes is one of the wildest and possibly most cathartic chapters in lumber camp folklore. And you can see why. If you've ever spent a summer evening near a Minnesota lake, you already believe half this story. It begins with a routine morning. Paul's sipping maple syrup like tea. Babe is grazing on icicle-dusted clover, and then a shadow passes overhead. At first, they think it's a cloud. Then it buzzes. Then it bites. Paul slaps his neck and leaves a crater. Thus begins the Great Mosquito War. According to the tale, the mosquitoes nested in a nearby bog the size of a county fair. They multiplied overnight. By noon, they were thick enough to block sunlight. By sunset, they had taken over the cookhouse and laid claim to the flapjack griddle. Paul, to his horror, was out of citronella, the first line of defense smoke. They burned pine needles, old boots, even a stack of Babe's frozen sneezes. But the mosquitoes adapted, forming squadrons and flying in formation. One group even attempted to carry off a lumberjack named Earl. He came back, but he's never quite been the same. Historians believe this story is a humorous response to real problems. Mosquitoes were and are an ever-present menace in the northern forests. Workers would drape themselves in netting smear on pungent oils and sleep under smoke clouds just to get a few hours of peace. The exaggeration, just a natural extension of shared suffering. But in Paul's version, things escalate quickly. Babe the Blue Ox becomes the artillery division. He stomps down, swamps, creates wind tunnels with his tail, and most famously lets out a sneeze so violent it forms a new lake and drowns an entire mosquito battalion. That lake still exists on some maps. Locals call it Skeeter Sink. Paul, meanwhile, arms the camp. Not with rifles too small, but with tree trunks sharpened into lances. The lumberjacks suit up in barrel armor. The cook straps pots to his limbs and screams for breakfast before charging. There's a particularly strange side story that's become its own folk tale. Paul allegedly trained a squadron of hummingbirds to fight back. How no one knows. Why? Because tiny angry allies make the best surprise twist in a mosquito battle. As the war stretches into its third day, the skies blacken with wings. The air is thick with buzz and the smell of pine tar. Paul finally climbs the tallest tree, yes climbs, and shouts an ultimatum. "Leave," he says, "or I'll personally relocate your swamp to Canada." The mosquitoes hesitate. He lifts his axe. They scatter. Victory is declared with a breakfast of triple-stack pancakes and celebratory bacon. Babe gets a wreath of frozen moss. The cookhouse receives reinforced screens. You hear murmurs around campfires that some mosquitoes survived, that they regrouped in the Yukon and are biding their time, that Paul once spotted one circling Alaska and said, "Not again." No one's confirmed it, but every now and then, someone finds a pine tree drained of sap and immediately checks the skies. Fringe theorists have jumped on this tale. Some claim the mosquitoes represent external threats to American progress, economic downturns, invasive forces, even foreign policy metaphors. Others say simply that logging was miserable, and if you're going to get bitten, you might as well imagine the mosquito is the size of a cow, so you can laugh about it later. You don't care either way. You're just glad the buzzing has died down. The camp is quiet again, save for the occasional thwop of a lumberjack finishing some unfinished mosquito business. Paul reclines beside Babe, scratches a welt the size of a pothole and grins. Well, he says, "At least we don't have black flies." You groan. Babe exhales a puff of frost shaped vaguely like a mosquito skull. You know better than to tempt fate. You're trudging through mud. Not normal mud. This is Paul Bunyan's mud, which means it's ankle deep for him, but waist high for you. It sucks at your boots with the tenacity of a hungry swamp. Babe lumbers ahead each step, forming ponds where birds immediately start swimming. You pause to wipe frost off your face and hear Paul's voice booming through the trees. She's thirsty again, and with that, he gestures toward Babe, who is visibly parched tongue, hanging out steam, curling from his nostrils, snowflakes forming as his breath hits the spring air. The problem: there's no body of water big enough to quench a snow-breathing ox the size of a steamboat. So naturally, Paul digs the Great Lakes, all 5 of them. In a weekend, you climb onto a boulder to get a better view. He starts by dragging his mighty axe in a wide arc across the landscape, slicing into the earth like a hot knife through buttered granite. Babe follows, carving out the edges with his hooves. By the time they finish, the map has changed. Permanently. Now let's be clear, no geologist supports this story. They'll talk about glacial activity, retreating ice sheets, and ancient rivers shaping the region over millennia. But they can't explain why some early frontier maps label the area as Paul's bathtub. Historians still argue whether this reflects a real frontier joke or just someone doodling after too much whiskey. You watch as Paul hauls buckets of water, each the size of a barn, from nearby rivers, dumping them into the new basins. Rain helps too. And the legend says that as soon as the lakes filled, Babe lowered his enormous snout, slurped, and lowered the water level by 3 feet. The fish were not amused. There's a follow-up story, of course. Because with Paul, there always is. After the Great Lakes were formed, the weather changed. Some say Babe's frosty breath chilled the new waters, altering the climate. Others whisper that the lakes became magical, so cold they could preserve logs for decades, and so clear that you could see the reflection of a myth staring back. You pass a cluster of lumberjacks watching Babe swim slow laps across Lake Michigan. It keeps him limber, one says. Besides, he likes the ferry boats. Sure enough, a tugboat toots its horn as Babe floats by, his blue back shimmering in the afternoon light. And here's where the story gets even stranger. One tale claims Paul tried to drain one of the lakes once just for cleaning purposes. he built a plug the size of a water tower and set it in the bottom. But when he pulled it, it caused a whirlpool so strong it spun the moon slightly off axis. The tides have never been the same since. You chuckle, but part of you wonders. There's also the pancake theory. Yes, really. One cook insists the lakes were flattened with Paul's breakfast griddle. The water pooled into the low spots, and voila. Convenient, wet, freshwater syrup reservoirs. Fringe folklorists go further. They suggest the lakes are symbolic, representing abundance ambition, or even a kind of divine laziness. Why hike for water when you can just make your own, they ask. A very Bunyan approach to problem solving. You stand now at the edge of Lake Superior. Waves lap gently against the shore. Somewhere across the water, you can see the outline of Babe's horn cutting through the mist. Paul is skipping rocks, well boulders with lazy precision. Each splash sounds like distant thunder. The lakes don't feel like myths here. They feel real, heavy, ancient, cold. Paul Neal's cups some water in his palm and lets it slip through his fingers. Still cold, he says. Good. You want to ask if he regrets carving them. If there's a part of him that misses the land before it was filled with water. But you don't. Because Paul doesn't look backward. He looks at what's needed and then he does something about it. Even if that something floods 5 states. You walk along the shoreline, the mud finally drying beneath your feet. Seagulls cry overhead. A squirrel is water skiing behind a frog. You don't even blink. And as you watch the sun begin to dip, glinting off the lakes he allegedly made with his bare hands, you realize something. Maybe it doesn't matter whether the story is true. Maybe what matters is that people still tell it. Because in a world that often feels too small, a tale about a man so big he had to make his own oceans feels just right. You smell it before you see it. The unmistakable scent of butter-scorched iron and enough maple syrup to drown a moose. You round the corner of the camp, and there it is, the griddle. Not just any griddle. This one is the size of a small state. Pancakes the size of trampolines sizzle across its dark cast-iron surface. You shield your face from the heat rising like waves off desert sand. Paul stands nearby, flipping flapjacks with a modified windmill blade, while Babe lazily drags a side of bacon across the top to grease it. Welcome to the tale of the Kansas-sized pancake griddle. Now how this all started depends on who's telling the story. Some say Paul got tired of cooking breakfast one flapjack at a time. Others say Babe challenged him to make a pancake so big it could serve as a replacement for the camp's lost tent roof. Regardless, the solution was obvious to Paul. Build a griddle big enough to cook for a small nation. The only issue, there was no skillet that big. So Paul made one. He flattened a mountain, melted down a derailed iron train, forged the surface in a nearby volcano that he borrowed for a weekend. And just like that, he had a griddle the size of Kansas. Literally, he built it there. Locals still argue whether a slight rise in western Kansas is just leftover pancake crust. You watch as the cooks team up like pit crews. One sprays butter from a backpack pump. Another pours batter from a silo strapped to a dirigible. A third times the perfect flip, calling out, "Now," and launching a flapjack into the air. that briefly blots out the sun. It lands with a sound like distant thunder. Paul grins. Just right. Of course, flipping pancakes that large requires finesse. There's a famous incident recounted in dozens of lumber camp variations where one poorly flipped cake flew east and landed in Ohio. It smothered a farmhouse. The residents reportedly didn't mind. They served coffee and charged admission. Babe, for his part, is in charge of quality control. He samples a bite from each finished cake, nods solemnly, and either snorts approval or sneezes disapproval, causing localized snowfall. One particularly dry pancake once triggered a frost warning in Nebraska. There are practical complications too. Syrup delivery is handled by a converted fire engine. Butter arrives by sled carved in the shape of geese for aerodynamic purposes. Eggs are cracked via controlled detonations, supervised by Paul's cousin, Dynamite Darla, who is banned in 3 territories for excessive omelet enthusiasm. Historians trace this whole tale to actual lumber camp traditions where cooks had to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of ravenous workers. Meals had to be fast-filling and frequent. Exaggerated food stories were a staple of campfire camaraderie. Because when your life is snow axes and sore shoulders, the thought of an all-you-can-eat breakfast that could serve an army is downright comforting. Still, scholars remain baffled by one curious detail: early 20th century promotional booklets by logging companies included sketches of giant griddles and blue oxen pulling breakfast wagons. Coincidence maybe, or maybe just maybe they knew. You get a little closer to the griddle and feel the heat radiating off it. Paul hands you a fork the size of a canoe paddle and offers you a corner slice of pancake. It's buttery, slightly crisp at the edge, and tastes faintly of cinnamon and adventure. You eat it without question. The ground under your feet trembles a little. Someone shouts, "Incoming," and you dive out of the way, just as another pancake lands. It ripples across the surface like a soft golden earthquake. There's even a fringe tale that NASA studied the griddle site as a potential launch pad because it was flat durable and smelled delicious. Nothing came of it, but the theory persists in certain syrup-sticky corners of the internet. And yes, every few years, some modern town claims to host the world's largest pancake breakfast, unaware, perhaps willfully, that Paul already won that race long ago. The cooking continues into the evening. Paul hums while flipping. Babe snores, frosting the bacon stockpile. The cooks dance between pools of batter like ballet dancers in flannel. You sit back, your belly full, your mind fuzzy with flour and folklore, and as you watch a pancake rise in the moonlight, slow, perfect airborne, you realize something in Paul Bunyan's world breakfast isn't just the most important meal of the day. It's a monument. You hear the crackle before you see the glow. It's subtle at first, a few orange flickers dancing in the treetops, the scent of pine sap gone sour. Then the sky deepens. The air thickens. A single shout echoes through the Dakota Valley fire. You scramble up a snowy ridge, just in time to see it, a forest fire wide as the horizon and moving fast. Red flames leap like hungry tongues from tree to tree, devouring everything in their path. Lumberjacks scatter. Birds evacuate in a screaming spiral. Even Babe pauses mid-sneeze, but Paul stays calm, He cracks his knuckles, rolls up his flannel sleeves, and heads for the barn, because tonight it's Paul versus fire. The tale goes that Paul Bunyan once fought an entire wildfire using nothing but a water barrel, a shovel, and a stubborn streak wide enough to dam the Mississippi. The barrel, of course, wasn't a barrel in the conventional sense. It was an old water tower, reinforced with iron hoops and mounted on a set of logging wheels. Babe pulled it. You watch as the team assembles. Paul hooks Babe to the rig, muttering, "Let's cool her down, big fella." The ox lets out a grunt that drops the temperature by 6 degrees. Paul grabs the hose, actually an old canvas fire hose stitched together from retired circus tents, and points it toward the flames. Then he opens the floodgates. The pressure nearly lifts him off the ground. Water arcs across the treetops, smashing into the inferno like a waterfall from a mountain god. Steam billows. Trees hiss. Somewhere in the blaze, a squirrel applauds and immediately faints from heat exhaustion. The rest of the camp leaps into action. Cooks run buckets of leftover flapjack batter to create fire breaks. Loggers stomp out embers with snowshoes. One guy throws himself dramatically into a puddle for morale. It's chaos, but it's coordinated chaos. Historians love this story because it likely stems from real fire suppression techniques in early logging days, before modern engines and planes crews relied on manpower water wagons and desperate innovation. Some camps even had dedicated fire trains with pumps and flatbeds loaded with barrels. Paul's tale, just that. Plus 300% scale and a talking ox. But there's more. According to one variation, Paul realized the fire wasn't going out fast enough. So he hiked up the nearest mountain, carving a stairway as he went and shouted into the clouds, "We need rain. Now." And the clouds, perhaps out of fear or respect, responded. It rained for 3 days. The fire died. The forest steamed for a week. And somewhere in the ashes, Babe found a perfectly roasted yam the size of a hay bale and considered it a win. Of course, there's another version less dramatic, more curious. Some say Paul didn't just fight the fire. He redirected it, dug a trench so deep the flames had nowhere to go but downward. The result? A scorched canyon still visible today, though most maps call it something boring like Black Hollow or Char Vale. Fringe theorists, because of course they exist, have interpreted the fire tale as metaphor. Paul, they argue, represents American expansion. The fire, the natural consequences. His heroic suppression, a wishful rewrite of frontier reality. But those same theorists often get distracted arguing about whether Babe had frost powers or if the griddle from earlier was secretly a sundial. You return to the present. Paul is still hosing down flames, though now the water has turned to steam, and the steam is forming weirdly artistic cloud animals. Someone's playing a banjo in the background because why not? Babe is curled around a smoking stump, snoring ice crystals. And the fire gone. Not a trace remains, except for one perfectly toasted marshmallow dangling on the end of a pine branch. Paul plucks it, inspects it, and offers it to you. It's warm, gooey, and tastes faintly of cinnamon and heroism. The camp cheers. A few loggers begin a song. Someone hoists Paul on their shoulders until Babe looks offended, and the group wisely sets him down. The forest is dark now, but calm. Wet pine needles glisten in the moonlight. You swear the trees seem taller. Thankful, you sit by the smoldering remains of a log, drying your boots and watching Paul mop his brow with a quilt, not because he has to, just because the job's done. And in Paul's world, that's all that matters. The storm rolls in like a freight train on snow-covered tracks. One moment, the air is still crisp, peaceful. The next wind howls through the trees like a ghost caught in a pipe organ. Snow comes sideways, thick and biting. You wrap your coat tighter and glance around the camp, but there's no panic, just Paul. He stands at the edge of camp hands on hips, squinting into the blizzard like it owes him money. Babe shuffles beside him, ice already forming on his eyelashes. The snow's coming fast, but no one moves to pack up. Because Paul's not running from this storm, he's logging through it. This is the story they call the Blizzard Logging Operation, a month-long stretch where Paul Bunyan continued to cut, haul, and process timber, while the rest of the frontier world froze solid. It was winter, so cold that trees cracked before you touched them. Snot froze mid-sneeze. Axes shattered like glass. And yet, the work went on. Paul didn't cancel anything. He doubled shifts. He issued snowshoes the size of dinner tables, built bonfires with whole pine trunks, and insulated the cookhouse with 2 feet of flapjack batter. Babe naturally led the hauling teams, dragging entire forests worth of logs across snow, so deep it swallowed cabins whole. You trudge beside them now, past a crew felling trees by headlamp and firelight. The saws screech against frozen bark. Every strike of an axe sends out a musical chime wood that cold rings like crystal. Paul tosses chopped trees over his shoulder like kindling. The logs land neatly stacked. No one asks how. It's Bunyan physics. The legend claims Paul outfitted every lumberjack with a heated coat stuffed with badger fur and lined with stove ash. Each worker was assigned a thermos the size of a barrel filled with coffee so strong it occasionally walked away on its own. The oddest innovation, the portable forest furnace. Essentially, a rolling furnace cart pulled by a confused-looking bear. It was designed to keep the immediate logging area thawed enough to work. It also roasted potatoes in a pinch. Multi-purpose. Historians point out that winter logging was real and brutal. Frozen ground allowed for easier hauling, but conditions were dangerous. Fingers and toes could go numb in minutes. Machinery froze. Horses balked. But Paul's story turns those struggles into triumph, into a challenge met with oversized grit and snowproof optimism. There's even a fringe variant of the tale, in which Paul trained local moose to wear boots and assist with hauling. Moose unionized shortly afterward and demanded flapjack breaks. Paul agreed. The blizzard continues. You watch as Paul guides a log slide down a makeshift ice ramp. The log skids gracefully into a stack. Someone cheers. Someone else slips and lands in a snowbank, emerging with icicle eyebrows and a grin. Morale is high. Night falls early during blizzard logging. The sky turns a deep indigo, and the snow glows faintly from all the campfires. You wander back toward the mess tent, where soup bubbles in a cauldron the size of a kiddie pool. The cooks hum lullabies while stirring. You spot Babe asleep nearby, his body forming a windbreak for half the camp. Snow piles on his back. He doesn't notice. Paul takes the night shift. Of course he does. He builds a small work table, sets a lantern beside it, and begins whittling. Out of what a tree, stump the size of a wagon. What's he making? No one knows. Possibly a rocking chair for a Yeti. Possibly a spoon. You sit beside him, watching the snow pile up. He speaks without looking up. Hard work warms you better than any fire. You nod, even though you're mostly warmed by 4 layers of wool and the soup still steaming in your belly. But he's not wrong. In this world of flannel and frostbite, doing something even logging during a storm is its own kind of heat. Later that night, the wind calms just enough for you to sleep. You curl beneath a quilt stitched from ox hair and coffee sacks, listening to the rhythm of distant chopping and the soft thud of logs finding their home. It's almost musical, and as your eyes close, the blizzard still howling outside, you know tomorrow brings more snow, more stories, more stacks of timber, tall enough to tickle the stars. But for now, you rest, warm, safe, in a storm that couldn't stop a myth. You wake to silence, not the calm kind, but the heavy, suspicious sort, like nature holding its breath. Snow lies deep and undisturbed across the camp. Not a single flannel shirt in sight. No smoke from the cookhouse. No thud of logs. Just soft whiteness stretching out in every direction like a giant's forgotten quilt. Paul's axe is missing. It's not in his tent. Not by the fire. Not wedged in a tree stump or stuck in the side of a cliff, which is where it usually turns up after a good day's work. This is not a drill. Paul Bunyan has lost his axe. You trail behind him now as he marches across the Dakota wilderness, a look of focused irritation on his face. Babe lumbers behind his breath, forming crystalline arcs in the morning air. Paul mumbles to himself as he checks increasingly unlikely locations, a hollow log under a frozen lake inside a snowman large enough to serve as seasonal housing. This is the story of the time Paul lost his axe. And if you've ever misplaced your keys, your wallet, or your sense of purpose halfway through a Monday, you'll understand the stakes. The axe isn't just a tool. It's the tool, the symbol, the legend, the blade that supposedly split mountains, stirred coffee in cauldrons, and once served as a canoe paddle during a flood. Without it, Paul's just tall. According to legend, the search stretched across multiple states and several time zones. Paul retraced every step he took over the past week, which included felling trees, flattening a frozen bog, and attending a square dance in North Dakota that allegedly ended in an accidental new canyon. Some say the axe walked away, that it had grown tired of chopping and wanted a new life, perhaps as a weather vane or a particularly aggressive plow. Others insist a jealous giant stole it in the dead of night, hoping to absorb its powers. One particularly outlandish theory involves a family of raccoons, a hot air balloon, and a grudge involving flapjack rights. You climb a ridge and look out over the snow-covered forest. Paul scans the horizon, shading his eyes. It's got to be here somewhere, he mutters. The funny part is the camp continues to run, sort of. The other loggers try to fill in. One uses a shovel as a stand-in. Another straps 2 butter knives to a stick and calls it Mini Paul. Spirits remain high, But no one can hide the truth. Without that axe, it's just not the same. Then comes the first clue. Babe snorts, digs into a snowbank, and pulls out something large metal and very much not an axe. It's a tree-shaped weather vane. Everyone stares. Paul sighs. Wrong week, he mutters. There are real-life roots to this tale. Historical logging tools were precious, hard to forge, harder to replace. Losing one could halt work for days. The myth of Paul's lost axe then might reflect deeper truths. The fragility of even the strongest systems, the occasional need to stop and retrace your path. The comedy of giants with forgetful pockets. The story has many endings, depending on who tells it. In one version, Paul finally finds the axe embedded in a glacier. He'd forgotten he'd used it to carve an impromptu freezer during a heat wave. In another, a beaver returns it, complaining that it made the river taste metallic. In yet another, the axe is never found, and Paul simply grows a new one from a seed he plants in a stump under a full moon. You wander into a clearing now. Paul stands in the center staring at the ground. There it is, half buried under fresh snow, glittering in the sunlight. His axe. He kneels, brushes off the snow, and lifts it effortlessly. The wind dies. A distant eagle cries. Somewhere, a coffee pot perks up in celebration. He twirls the axe once, then rests it on his shoulder. Knew it'd turn up, he says, which is classic. Paul completely unfazed, as if he hadn't just spent 3 days dragging half the upper Midwest looking for a chunk of steel the size of a canoe. Back at camp, the cheers are thunderous. The cooks fire up the griddle. Babe rolls in a celebratory snowball the size of a hay bale. You sit by the fire watching Paul oil the axe's handle with something that smells like pine and cinnamon. And you think about all the times you've lost things. Keys, tools, names in the middle of conversations, and how sometimes the looking is just as important as the finding, especially if you find your way back with a story in your pocket. You're staring at the northern lights, and for once, they seem brighter than Paul's campfire. The sky pulses with ribbons of green, pink, and gold, like the whole universe is exhaling. Snow sparkles underfoot. The world feels still. Paul Bunyan is quiet tonight, not because he's tired. Paul doesn't get tired, but because something shifted. He stands at the edge of the forest axe, in hand eyes on the sky. Babe is beside him, unusually still, frost curling gently from his nostrils like steam from a sleeping volcano. This is the part of the tale folks whisper, the disappearance of Paul Bunyan into the northern sky. It starts without warning. One day, Paul simply stops building, stops cutting. The cookhouse doesn't smell like bacon. The griddle goes cold. Babe won't eat his usual frozen squash. The trees, for the first time in decades, grow in peace. No footprints, no sawdust, just wind and memory. You walk with Paul now through the woods, the snow crunching beneath his boots in a steady rhythm. He's not sad, not worried, just ready. You don't ask where he's going, because part of you already knows. He's going up. The story says Paul left this world through the aurora borealis. That one night, under a sky brighter than any sunrise, he walked north with Babe, past the last pine tree, across a frozen river that wasn't there the day before, and into the light. Some say he carved steps into the side of the sky. Others claim Babe took flight hooves, light as air steam, trailing behind like comet tails. A few swear they saw Paul wave once, just once, before the light swallowed him whole. Historians naturally dismiss this version. Folklore they scoff. Romantic nonsense. But even they can't explain the sudden drop-off in Bunyan tales after a certain winter, or the frozen hoofprints found hundreds of miles north, hoofprints too big to fake. And what of the axe? Some say it was left behind, embedded in a stump, high on a mountaintop. Others say Paul took it with him, intending to trim the stars. One fringe theorist insists the Big Dipper is really just Paul's tool belt hung up for the night. You find yourself back at the old camp, now abandoned. Snow has overtaken the bunkhouses. Icicles hang like glass teeth from the cookhouse eaves. The griddle is buried, a pancake fossilized beneath layers of frost. But it doesn't feel lonely. It feels settled. You walk past the old sleds, now full of snowdrifts, past the log piles that will never be hauled, and finally, to Babe's old resting spot, still slightly concave in the earth, now home to a huddle of sleeping foxes. You look up, and there it is, a shimmer in the sky brighter than usual, moving just a bit, like something stirring just beyond reach. A hint of motion in the lights, a familiar shape, or maybe just a trick of tired eyes. Some towns claim Paul still visits. That strange footprints appear overnight. That sap flows in winter. That pancakes cook themselves in abandoned camps. Every so often, a tree falls without wind, and someone swears they heard a distant laugh echo through the woods. Scholars still argue whether Paul's disappearance into the aurora symbolizes retirement rebirth, or simply the last big joke of the lumber camp tradition. Some say he became a constellation. Some say he's waiting for the next big project, maybe on the moon, maybe on Mars. But here in the snow-covered quiet, it feels like a proper goodbye. No fanfare, no fireworks, just a giant and ox, and a sky willing to take them. You sit on a stump that might have once been his chair. The wind shifts. It's not cold, not really. You close your eyes, and somewhere overhead, the lights ripple. The fire crackles low, casting a soft orange halo across the snow. You're alone now, or maybe not alone, just the only one awake. The camp is a quiet skeleton of stories, empty mugs by the cold griddle footprints, slowly filling with frost and that ever-present stillness of deep night. But something remains. The memory of a myth still echoes. You rise and wander slowly past the places where Paul once stomped, built, laughed, and lumbered. Every stump feels like a monument. Every tree still standing feels like one that earned its place. And somehow, even though the sky is dark, the world feels lighter. You find yourself standing in front of a statue, one of the many that dot the towns scattered across the north. Paul Bunyan, carved in concrete, smiling down at children holding cotton candy next to souvenir shops and log-shaped benches. Babe, too, cast in fiberglass, eyes wide, and horns just a little too shiny. To some, it's kitsch. Americana at its most commercial. But you stand there gazing up at the molded grin, and you know better. You've walked the snows he walked. You've seen the frost from Babe's breath. You've eaten the pancake, and you understand these aren't just tourist traps. They're altars to an idea that even the tallest tales can have roots. Each town claims him. Bemidji, Minnesota says he was born there. So does Bangor, Maine. Kelleher has his grave. Oregon insists he passed through. Michigan's got his boot prints. It's like trying to pin down the wind. Every place wants to be a part of something so enormous it can't possibly belong to one zip code. And that's the magic. Paul Bunyan isn't about facts. He's not about historical records or geological accuracy. He's a mirror held up to the American frontier, wild, vast, stubborn, and oddly hopeful. His stories weren't meant to be believed, they were meant to be shared, around campfires, at kitchen tables, tucked into bedtime whispers when snow rattles the windows. You glance back up at the stars and wonder how many other myths we've sent into the sky. How many impossible men and women we've invented just to give the hard times a softer edge. Paul wasn't born of conquest. He was born of cold mornings, stiff boots, and laughter that had to echo louder than the wolves. Even now his presence lingers. In the way, loggers still call their biggest tools Bunyan-sized. In the way, pancakes still feel like celebration. In the way, a kid with a crayon draws a blue ox with a happy face, and no one tells them that's not how oxen work. And in you, because you've walked this whole strange snowy story, you've eaten the breakfasts, swung the oversized axe, weathered the mosquito siege, and stood at the edge of the aurora as it took him home. You smile because you understand now that Paul was never really about being big. He was about leaving space for others to dream big. So, you pull your coat tighter, brush a snowflake from your collar, and turn to leave the statue behind. Your footprints are soft in the fresh snow, but someone somewhere will see them in the morning and tell a story. The snow falls gently now. Not the wild wind-driven kind, but slow, soft flakes that drift down like sleepy thoughts. The camp is gone, the fires are cold, but the warmth lingers in your chest. You've walked far across frozen lakes, up carved canyons, under skies lit by tales too big for the page. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop. Paul's axe is back in its place. Babe sleeps beneath the stars, one eye slightly open, in case another pancake comes flying by. And the night is silent, except for the hush of memory. You're safe here, wrapped not in wool, but in wonder. This world of frost and flannel, of impossibly tall men and griddles wider than roads, it was never about belief. It was about the comfort of imagining something just big enough to carry the weight of your day, of your week, of your winter. So let go now. No need to hold the reins or stack another log or fight off another mosquito the size of a wagon. Let Paul take it from here. Let him carve a trail into your dreams and stomp through your sleep like only a gentle giant can. Breathe in. Breathe out. You're part of the story now. A listener. A dreamer. A quiet footnote in the softest legend ever told by firelight. Good night, traveler. Sweet dreams.